This is the story of the ghost in the sagegrass field. Robert was 17 and near about grown, but Carrie was just a little slip of a girl when they went to stay with their big sister, Fanny. Now, Fanny had gotten married and moved to Cookeville, Tennessee with her husband. They were living in a little old house on the Capshaw property where the Putnam County Library stands today. Now, Fanny's husband, his work took him away from town, and she was often home alone at night. And she was afraid of the dark, so she had invited her brother and sister to come and keep her company. Well, they had just settled in on their stay with their sister when Robert announced one night after supper that he was going to walk into town. Now, at this time, the Capshaw place was not far from a sagegrass field that was known as Billy Goat Hill. Folks who lived in town let their animals graze in the field. A few years before this, there had been a public execution in that sagegrass field on Billy Goat Hill. It was the only public execution ever to take place in Putnam County, Tennessee. Back in 1878, just a few years before this, the Brassel brothers, Joe and Teek, had been hung on the spot for the murder of the Allison brothers in Baxter, Tennessee. It had been quite an event. There may have been as many as 20,000 witnesses to the execution. And even now, years later, people were still talking about it and the murder that had led up to it. Well now, said Fanny, you know, if you walk to town, you're going to have to go by that hanging place. I don't care about no hanging place, said Robert. I ain't afraid of haints or ghosts. I'm going to town, and I'll see you all later. Well, Robert left, and Fanny and Carrie latched the door, and then they built up the fire. And they were just getting cozy and warm in their seats when outside they heard the most horrible hollering coming closer. Well, pretty soon they recognized Robert's voice. But before they could get up and open the door for him, he hit the door and it fell crash onto the floor inside the little house with Robert on top of it. Well, he lay there howling and shrieking and carrying on and just quivering. Finally, Fanny and Carrie got him calmed down enough to where they could set him up in a chair and he could tell them what had happened. He said, well, I was headed to town. I was coming toward that sagegrass field and I wasn't thinking about being afraid of nothing, said Robert. But then I blinked. And right there in the middle of that field, right where they hung them two boys, I saw somebody standing there. He was a tall, thin man, and he was wearing tight white clothes, like maybe he was wearing his long underwear. Well, I blinked again, and he was still there. And I began to think, well, one brother, Joe, he confessed to the crime. But Teek, the other brother, swore always that he was innocent. Well, maybe this tall, thin man in white was Brother Teek, come back to haunt the folks who, even though he swore he was innocent, they hung him anyway. Well, I took off out of there, said Robert, and here I am. Well, the girls finally got him calmed down enough to go to bed, but he didn't sleep any that night. And the next morning he got up and went to work, but he wasn't much good to anybody. And from that day on, as long as he lived in Putnam County, which was the most of the rest of his life, Robert never would go by that sagegrass field, not even in the daytime. And Robert always said to the end of his days, "That Billy Goat Hill ain't nothing to mess with, especially in the dark." And that's the story of the ghost in the sagegrass field.